All right, how's everybody? So I want to welcome you to the final match of the 29th Annual Ethics Bowl National Championships. We did it. Stoked. All right, so what we are going to do is we have some awards to give out. So we're going to do the awards prior to inviting the two top teams up here for the final match. So we're going to go through some of these. First off, I want everybody to give a really big round of applause to our volunteers. Like I said, we had 90 people. I want to particularly say thank you to the organizing committee. And this is absolutely going to drive her nuts, but I want to give a really special shout out to one of my former students from 2003 that has been with me all of these years, that we could not have done this without her. Taz, stand up. All right, with that said, we have some trophies to give out. So we had some amazing top 8 teams. So we are going to invite each of the quarterfinal teams and the semifinal teams one by one to come up and receive their trophy and be able to get some pictures taken, and let's cheer for them. So is University of Arizona here? Come on up. All right. All right, this next team is actually from my region in California, UC Santa Barbara. Oh, coaches, come on. All right. All right, next is University of Colorado Boulder here. All right. And our last quarterfinals team, United States Military Academy, West Point. All right, now I want to introduce our semifinalist teams. This is Seattle University here. All right, and our next semifinal team, Youngstown State. All right. All right, so I'm going to invite Rachel Robinson Green, who is the chair-elect. She's going to come up and she's going to give a few other awards out for us. So Rachel.
All right, these two awards are near and dear to the hearts of the Ethics Bowl organizers because they're awards that are supposed to go to to people involved in the activity that best exemplify the spirit of the Ethics Bowl. So first we'll give out the Laydenson Award, which is the award that goes to the team that participated at the national tournament that best exemplified the spirit of the Ethics Bowl. And for 2025, that award goes to Georgia Southern University. This next award goes to a volunteer that works in the Ethics Bowl. It could be a coach, it could be an organizer who best exemplifies the spirit of the Ethics Bowl. And this award is named in honor of Pat Croskery, who was the chair of the Ethics Bowl two times before Michael here, so before Richard. And Pat Croskery was just a wonderful person and just really demonstrated the virtues that are associated with the Ethics Bowl. This award was really hard to give this year because there were very strong nominees that each were very deserving. And the letters that each received on their behalf were just extremely compelling. But the person who won the award this year received, I think, 15 or 16 separate letters of recommendation that were all remarkable. So the winner of the Cross Creed this year is UVU coach Jeff Nielsen.
So I'm going to invite the next person from APPE up that if not for her, this also would not be possible. Kristen, she's going to come give another award that's going to be really important for us. So Kristen, do you want to come up?
Thanks, Michael. Can we give Michael one big round of applause, please? Thank you. I know he won't do that himself. Okay. For the third year, the APPE board would like to present the Virtue and Service Award to someone who has been a longtime supporter of APPE, the APPE Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl, and who embodies the spirit of the Ethics Bowl. The inaugural awards went to both Bob Laydenson and Joanne Laydenson, and last year we awarded longtime case writer Robert Skipper. This year, we'd like to award another person who has provided invaluable support to the growth of Ethics Bowl. This person started coaching Ethics Bowl before most of you all were alive and has been a coach for many years. He also chaired the Rules Committee and helped start the Wasatch Regional Bowl and served as the regional organizer for many years, only interrupted by his 7 years as IEB chair of the council, a purely volunteer role that is demanding and, let's face it, thankless. During his time as chair, he came up with the concept of the summer workshop, which still continues today. But perhaps what he is best known for is his Ethics Bowl spreadsheet, at least among regional hosts and reps. As one of his nominators for this award wrote, he created a fully customizable, fully online, and real-time updatable spreadsheet that is used for all of the judging and moderating now in virtually every region and in the National Bowl. Every year, people from around the country ask for versions of this spreadsheet. He has now made 185 different versions of this spreadsheet for different regions and events, making adjustments for different rules, structures, and number of teams. When someone asks him, he drops everything to make sure that they have what they need quickly. In addition to IEB, he has been deeply involved with both the high school and bioethics bowls, and since stepping down as the chair of the IEB Council, he has continued to help organize the IEB National Tournament every year. As a nominator wrote, his impact on the history and development of the bowl nationally and globally cannot be overstated. I know everyone in this room probably knows who I'm talking about, as we should. On behalf of the APPE IEB Committee and the APPE Board, I would like to present Richard Green with the 2025 APPE Virtue and Service Award.
Thank you, Richard, for everything that you've done for all of us. All right, are you guys ready? All right, I'm going to invite the two teams up. So, Mallister, come on up. Stanford, where are you at? All right, I'm going to invite our three judges, Richard Green, Mark Dorley, and Tasneem Sadeh. Pass it to each other. Don't talk too close.
Take it out, or is it like?
Keep it in. Just move it.
Okay.
It's a lot easier.
Yeah. So as we speak, we pass it. Okay. All right. Okay.
All right, so are both teams ready?
Yes. Yes.
All right, what we need to do, though, is we need to flip a coin, determine who's going to be Team A and Team B. So, Stanford, we're going to have you guys call it for me.
Heads, please.
Heads, okay. So, last year, when I was moderating, I dropped this coin. And in fact, there was a picture taken of me at that exact moment that was sent to my son. He made a sticker out of it, and who has been trolling me for the last 12 months. Aiden, it's your turn. Come on up.
You got this, Aiden. You'll do way better.
Don't drop it.
You're going to be way
Cameras
better.
are focused.
No pressure. Heads, please. Smooth.
Second. Thank you.
All right, judges.
We have score sheets.
Michael.
Yep.
Score sheets.
All right, so I'm getting in score sheets. Let's have everybody introduce themselves. So, McAllister, would you guys all like to please introduce yourselves for our crew?
Sure. My name is Madeline, and I'm a first year at Macalester College.
My name's Eva. I'm a junior at Macalester College. I study political science and Latin American studies.
Hi, my name's Colette. I'm a sophomore and I study philosophy, sociology, Chinese, and critical theory.
Hi, my name is Siham. I'm a first year. I study history and critical theory.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruta. I am a sophomore economics and computer science major.
Hi, my name is Vin. I'm a sophomore and I study economics and computer science.
Stanford.
Hello, everyone. This is the team from Stanford. My name is Georgios. I'm a senior studying chemical engineering.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mirabai. I'm a sophomore studying economics and psychology.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ursula. I'm a senior studying symbolic systems.
Hi, I'm Allie. I'm a third year and I'm studying philosophy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie and I'm a senior studying linguistics.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charlotte. I'm a sophomore and I'm studying computer science.
Judges.
Hi, I'm Richard. I make spreadsheets.
I'm Mark Dorley from Villanova University, and we all agreed that we had to do a shout out to my wife who's watching us live stream. And her name's Kathy Nevins, so please Google that so her name goes up in the search.
Hi, I'm Taz. I was the former debater. I'm here on the stage with my philosophy professor. And I'd just like to take a quick second. Over the last 2 days, we've heard so many amazing presentations, such thoughtful deliberations, and some of the best responses to judges' questions. So I know this is a competition, but truly, you are all the champions for the way you approach the Ethics Bowl, embody the spirit, have critical thought, and hopefully you're just like me, come back for 20 plus years to volunteer and judge and moderate, because this is probably the most important thing that many of us do. And there are no words to thank our coaches and professors for the work and the heart they put into this. So thank you all for being here, for being the beacon of hope that you are for so many, and best of luck.
Verbal as well as
just
visual.
visual.
Just visual? Okay. All right. So I'm going to put these down. Please don't open them yet until I read the question. All right. The first case is case number 2. Begin the Star Wars half. Question is, if you were tasked with outlining United States policy with respect to the use of space weaponry, what would that policy look like? And please provide moral justification for your position. You have 2 minutes. Your time starts now.
I remember this question.
Thank you, Claude.
Yes.
Yes.
So you did the nomination. How did I miss that?
Maybe.
I need it before we start.
Is he shouting?
Make sure they have both moral and political. What about the other negative externalities? Also, yes, absolutely. We can also think about like global citizenship. And global citizenship, at what point is it necessary? Yes. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Yeah. All other means of necessity, and there's a clear threat. So my question was just one about the incidental. Yes, incidental. That's literally.
Okay, can I have the case?
We only do ideal theory. Yeah, exactly. And it's not give extra time for passing. Right? Let's
Can I have the case, please?
I honestly think we should just tilt it. I'll just be in charge of it.
Thank you.
All right, that is time.
I'm sitting here on the stage and my son's hitting me up.
All right, McAllister, you guys have up to 10 minutes to respond to the moderator question. I will give you non-verbal 3 and 1 minute warnings. Your time starts now.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you to Stanford, thank you to our judges, and thank you to everyone else. We're really excited to discuss Case 2, Begin the Star Wars Have. Just to give a brief summary of the case, Case 2 discusses the militarization of space. To put it simply, it kind of hedges this in the context of the Cold War and kind of leaves the call to action of space is being militarized, things are happening, what should we do? The question reflects this. The question we're answering today is, if you were tasked with outlining the United States policy with respect to the use of space weaponry, what would that policy look like? Our policy is that defense weaponry can be morally manufactured by the United States, but the US cannot take any action in space unless all other diplomatic means of action have been exhausted. Colette will mention our framework of consequentialism in just a second, but we really want to note that the United States is acting in a context. We don't want nuclear war. We don't want space war. We don't want violence. Again, we are viewing this through a frame of consequentialism, which Colette will cover. Then we will move on to Ruta, who will discuss why we don't want space war, why violence is bad, and why nuclear weapons and the weaponization of space is a net negative. Then we'll kind of connect this to the international context. We think it's really important to know that the United States is not in a vacuum, especially under a frame of consequentialism. Siham will conclude our section of moral considerations with what should the US do concretely? What do these policies look like? And at what point does the US have an obligation to act? And then Madeline and myself will conclude with some opposing viewpoints, what you might contend with us and how we would answer. I'll pass it on to Colette.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eva. So today, as Eva said, we're going to be viewing this case through a framework of consequentialism. We want a perfect world, but we also grapple with the fact that this isn't realistically possible. So we want to focus on minimizing harms as much as possible and consequences of space militarization, not just to the US, but to the world as a whole. And we want to emphasize that the stakes of this case are extremely high. We're talking weapons of mass destruction and space war here. And so throughout our case, we're going to keep weaving in potential consequences, but also grappling with this, how is this happening in a realistic world? And first, to take you through some more stakes of space militarization, I'm going to pass you physically and literally to my teammate Ruta.
Thank you so much, Colette. First, as we kind of delve into this very important topic, right, of weaponization, of preserving our space, we would like to recognize that war and violence are not neutral, but really bad things that are tearing our society apart currently. We recognize that a world with more weapons is by not any means a safer world. We reject this logic that everyone having more and more and more weapons makes us safer. In the future, ideally, right, we would like to see a world that is not torn apart by these violent conflicts where intrinsic human life, human rights are being violated, people's lives are being taken away. We recognize that the United States, as a global superpower, has an obligation, because of the dire consequences that all of these weapons cause, not to initiate a diplomatic conflict into a violent one, right? We recognize that this does not apply to the United States only. Every single global superpower of the world, any power that has these weapons of mass destruction, has an inherent responsibility not to start a violent conflict because of the dire consequences that it has on all citizens of our planet. We also acknowledge the space weaponry and the Kessler effect that comes with it, right? We recognize that the consequences are not only on human life, but we have space that is full of satellites that where if some some debris gets away from the space weaponry, it can kind of create bigger and bigger and bigger collisions that damage our satellites, that damage our means to communicate that we find integral in today's society. With that being said, I'm going to pass it on to Vin to talk more.
Thank you, Ruta. I will address the question of what should the international community do. We understand that this case is about the US, but we need to acknowledge that the US is not a solitary actor in the world, especially in a frame of consequentialism. We care about all consequences. It is the reality that many countries, including the United States, spends a lot of money on military spending. We take the view that it's neither too optimistic that just weaponization won't happen, nor do we take the view that it's too pessimistic that weaponization is simply inevitable. There is a taboo now where space is treated as special, that it is actively not being weaponized. What we mean by that is the deployments of weapons in space. We can look at the example of the chemical weapons ban as the international community setting a standard against an indiscriminate and horrible violence that can be caused by such weapons. Space war is indiscriminate. If the US goes to war in space with another country, it doesn't just affect those two countries. It affects the commercial and scientific interests of all countries that use space, which is to say all countries in the world. What we want to encourage is not just the US, but the international community enforcing this taboo against weaponization because of the negative consequences that my teammate has laid out.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ben. So now I'm going to address, what specifically should the U.S. do, and maybe at what point is militarization necessary? Because it may become a little blurry to find that line. So I think it's really important to reiterate what my teammate Ruta said. How we should only militarize when all other means have been exhausted. The U.S. as a global superpower and an extremely strong country has the moral obligation to not escalate diplomatic conflicts into military ones. So to begin with this process, if the time comes, there needs to be a clear threat, and all other diplomatic means needs to have been exhausted. As you mentioned in our frame, we want to reduce the consequences as much as possible. We also want to recognize the inherent value of life and how countries, specifically the US, has an obligation to ensure that everyone is safe, not just people within their borders. There is a difference, we think, between being hopeful and responsible. While it is, okay and maybe even, good to be hopeful and hold out on this technology as much as possible, when other countries do begin to militarize and do begin to use this technology and it becomes a clear threat and the US does not do anything, that is becoming simply irresponsible. So in this case, that the US does go and militarize, we think that they should not withdraw and create that power vacuum for other bad actors to possibly step in. Ultimately, with this frame, we believe that, they should wait we believe that they should wait until they've used all diplomatic measures before moving to military, and wait until there is a clear threat that has been shown. I will now pass it to another teammate.
Thank you so much, Siham. Yeah, to just kind of go into some opposing viewpoints, a really big thing that we butted up against in our discussion of this case is the idea of military abolition. If the military is kind of, through a view of a military abolitionist, if it is kind of an extension of oppressive forces in the world, if it is furthering oppression, why aren't we just for total military abolition, especially if we think violence is bad and the military is clearly furthering violence? And we think this is a really interesting perspective, and we do, in the long term, we are pro-military abolition. We think that there are some really negative consequences that come from the military that we want to minimize through abolition. But we understand, as I hope my colleagues have outlined clearly, as they did outline clearly, is that military abolition in this moment is not tenable, unfortunately. We think right now, with the stakes of the geopolitics and the way that the world is arranged, it is just not tenable to completely demilitarize. It leaves your citizens and your country at a disadvantage that a government cannot take on the burden of. But we do think, again, in the long term, we do want to explore avenues for military abolition, for living in a more peaceful world. Another opposing viewpoint that we really thought about a lot is kind of this idea that humans are in a way inherently violent. Through going through diplomatic means, aren't we kind of pushing off the inevitable? It's always kind of been the case that the strong take what they want and everyone else just deals with this. How do we kind of deal with this? It's very true that the first actor advantage is real. You get in there and no one else can. And while we do think that this is important to consider, we just want to be really clear that we fundamentally disagree with the opinion that humans are inherently violent. They are just as inherently violent as they are anything else, as inherently violent as they are inherently collaborative. We think it's really important, especially when conducting geopolitics, to recognize that humans do want to work with others. They do want to make solutions that fix the world. Additionally, we think this perspective of humans as inherently violent is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The same with the first actor's advantage. Because once you act, someone else is forced to act. When you bring violence in the world, someone else does violence. Violence begets violence, if you will. Additionally, we want to be really clear that especially through a consequentialist frame, which is our frame for the case, that this idea of first actor's advantage and inherent violence is not a way to navigate geopolitics, and it's not a way to navigate the world. The US cannot simply think about consequences for itself. It also has to think about global consequences. What happens when the US makes these global moves? What happens to the rest of the world?
Yeah, so we also talk about how we're against the researching of this offensive technology, but just the technology is not necessarily what you gain from this kind of research. There's plenty of technology that we use day to day that's very important to our lives that was found from military research. And so are we okay with completely forsaking these gains? And to be clear, we are in favor of some research of defensive technology, so we can make those gains from that as well. But also, we are not totally in favor of completely militarizing because we might have some incidental gains from that. And with that, I'll pass it to Eva.
Thank you so much, Madeline. So just to briefly conclude, today we answered the question, if you were tasked with outlining the United States policy with respect to the use of space weaponry, what would that policy look like? To which we said, our policy would specifically outline that no action in space can be taken unless all other means have been exhausted except for the development of defensive weapons. Thank you so much for your time. It was very...
All right, Stanford. 1 minute. Time starts now.
Wait, Charlotte. Charlotte's in her.
Can I do? I have the obligations of the government to its citizens. Yes, I was going to say that. You can say it. I would say their position would lead them to say you can never go to war if you consider the global community. I feel like that's less important. Okay, so Ursula, me, George, Jason. Wait, Allie should go. Right? I'm giving your theory would say you would never go to war. Okay, then I will go. You go after me. Okay, excellent. So here's one. Let's just be composed. Let's transition.
All right, that's time. Stanford, would you like verbal, nonverbal, both?
Just visual, please.
Visual, okay. You have up to 5 minutes to respond to Mallister. Your time starts now.
Okay, thank you so much, Mallister, for your wonderful presentation. Our understanding of your position is that the United States ought not take any action unless all other diplomatic efforts are exhausted. This means we should refrain from militarizing unless we're only going for defensive weapons. I'd like to start with a first objection about the importance of deterrence. And I think to start this off, I want to draw a distinction between the development and use of weapons. We fully agree with you that the United States should never initiate any other conflict unless there is a clear threat like you talk about. However, we believe that the United States may need to develop offensive weapons in order to deter adversaries from entering into a conflict first. There's a famous phrase, if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. Why? Because in order to deter an adversarial threat, the United States needs to have a credible threat of retaliation. If we only have defensive weapons, then nothing stops an adversary like Russia from retaliating first or from attacking first, knowing we have no threat of retaliation. And so I worry that if we just wait until all diplomatic measures or there's a clear threat of harm, we're allowing adversaries to secretly stockpile weapons while we wait for a clear sign. And I really appreciate that you all take a very realistic lens. But on this level of realism, ought we not assume that other countries are developing, like we see in the case at hand? Russia has already banned this, not accepted this treaty, and is already shown to be developing space weapons. Are we supposed to wait and let our adversaries get ahead of us? And if anything, we think under a consequential lens, this increases the probability of conflict rather than decreases it. With that being said, I'm going to pass it off to my teammate, Charlotte.
Thank you, Ursula. So I'm very worried about how you guys have seemingly mischaracterized defensive and offensive space weapons, right? Defensive space weapons, yes, can be like anti-satellite missiles, but can also be things like cyber attacks or targeted lasers that don't have these like violent harms that you guys allude to again and again. These can include targeted military objectives that are taken down by infrastructure with no violence at all. And I believe that this is a morally relevant difference because you guys have employed a consequentialist framework that bases your case around we shouldn't develop offensive weapons, or we shouldn't use offensive weapons because they cause violence. But offensive weapons can not cause violence. And so I would like for you to respond to that if possible. With that, I'd like to pass it on to Allie.
Thanks, Charlotte. So I'm currently thinking about a potential unintuitive extension of your case and its values. So I'm wondering, you've really emphasized the importance of under your consequentialist framework, minimizing harms, considering the global community. I'm wondering, why is it justified for the US to go to war at all under your framework? It seems like it might minimize harms if we just sacrifice the US and let the nation attack, and then the US wouldn't erupt in like the destruction it would cause by engaging in this war. So it seems like you also defend later that the US does have a right to defend its own interests and its own citizens. But I'm looking for some more ethical backing for why you would justify that position, because it seems like consequentialism doesn't do enough load bearing to defend that particular position. And I'd look for an expansion in your case. With that, I'll pass it off to my next teammate.
Thank you, Allie. So I would also like to touch upon this consequential framework that you guys are using as your moral backing for this position. I particularly want to talk about the purpose of governments. So at one point in your speech, you mentioned that the US has an obligation to kind of provide or promote safety, not just for its citizens, but for people beyond its borders, and that that's one of the reasons why we would deter violence. And so I'm wondering, where does the moral backing for this claim come from? It seems that from the purpose of governments, they are obligated solely to provide protection for their citizens' rights. What do they owe to citizens outside of their borders, rather global citizens? And also, it seems that in line with this obligation to protect one's citizens, that this might require you to escalate conflict at times. I mean, the last 70 years of peace have kind of been framed by this idea of, well, not peace, but since the Cold War, international relations have been framed by mutually assured destruction. Next, I'll pass it off to my next teammate.
Thank you. I want to conclude by giving you one peripheral objection, which is other types of weapons. And specifically, we can look to things like chemical weapons. We could imagine a situation where a chemical weapon is used to kill a very small number of people, but yet you argued in your case that we can look to chemical weapons as something that should be banned. So if we're only killing a very small number of people, say the same as an AK-47 could kill, why is it that chemical weapons would be so much worse under a consequential framework? It seems that when we come to war, there are some things that are intrinsically wrong that you cannot cross, and we're wondering where that fits into a consequential framework. With that, we want to thank you for your presentation, and we look forward to your response.
That's fine. All right, Mallister, you have 1 minute. Your time starts now.
Okay, yes. Defensive. Okay, defensive versus offensive. I will take that. Yeah, okay. Oh, why is it justified for the use for I got it. What is your yes, the government. Okay. That is the same. Okay, thank you. Okay. And then chemical weapons. Yes. And social media. If I like to take a human. Okay, I will take that.
All right, McAllister, that's time. All right, you guys have up to 5 minutes to respond to Stanford's commentary. Your time starts now.
Thank you so much, Stanford, for your 5-minute questions. They really pushed us on our case and thought of us to think further about the scope of our case and the scope of our logic in general. So you guys asked some questions about specifically deterrence, other countries developing space weapons, about defensive weaponry, about our framework of consequentialism, and applying that to different situations. So first, to talk a little bit about deterrence and weapons, I'm going to pass it over to my teammate, Ruta.
Thank you so much, Colette. In your question about deterrence and whether kind of more weapons would deter more war, we take the example of the status quo. Currently, we live in the world where so many countries have nuclear weapons of mass destruction that could destroy the land we live on as it is right now. Under your kind of the framing of the question, that is the ultimate deterrence. The weapon of mass destruction already exists, and yet We see conflict all over the world. We do not live in times of peace. So with that, that is why it is important that, right, we see other harms in space, that these weapons of mass deterrence already exist, even if that were true, which we do not think it is. But with space, we also see other harms that come with it. And I'm going to pass it on to Vin to talk a little bit more about it.
Thank you, Rita. You mentioned defensive weapons like cyber attacks or ASATs, anti-satellite missiles. I'll take those in turn because I think that those are two different things. Cyber attacks is not something that is special to space. If somebody attacks you, attacks your personal data, attacks your national secrets and your national security, you have a right to defend yourself against that. As for anti-satellite weapons, that is different because that is special to space. Once you attack like a satellite, what happens is that you create like enormous amounts of space debris, and we know that even like flecks of paint, even centimeters, millimeters of dust can really disable entire satellites. Having a war in space is incredibly destructive, partly because you can't really come back from it. If you have a war in space and there is this Kessler syndrome that happens once like satellites get taken out, it is very, very hard to clean that up, to change that. And that is the difference in this case.
Additionally, to add a little bit more onto that answer, when we're talking about this dichotomy between defensive and offensive weapons and how offensive weapons can be non-violent, we really want to think about the effects of these offensive non-violent weapons on the global community. While maybe it isn't doing direct violence with an offensive weapon, there are going to be spiraling outcomes from that. So maybe the US attacks with a non-violent offensive weapon. How does Russia retaliate? We think that's really important, especially under our consequentialist frame. I'll pass it to Colette to say a little bit more.
Yeah, so you guys ask about how is it justified under our consequentialist framework for the US to go to war at all? And you guys also talk about, is there a moral backing for US kind of owing global citizens? And to this, we want to kind of challenge you to expand our consequentialist framework into a global perspective. Remember, the US doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a global powerhouse. We have an impact, and that impact is quite large. Rolling over and, leaving other bad actors to just take over has consequences for other countries as well, and it leaves them extremely vulnerable. We have to remember the US is important in a global context, and, really broadening the consequences of, letting just the US go to war is quite irresponsible. And so I'm going to pass it over to my teammate to expand a little more.
Thank you so much, Colette. Yeah, to just zero in on the second half of that question you asked about what does the US owe to the rest of the world? And we think that comes from a lot of what Colette is saying, that the US is a global powerhouse. And when you want to look especially about how the US got there, right? The US became a global powerhouse through unanimously unethical means because of the clearly extractive, imperialist, and colonial ideologies and things that they have forwarded to become who they are in the world. They do have a special responsibility to do good in the world. Additionally, to very briefly answer your final question about chemical weapons versus an AK-47 and whether or not some things are intrinsically wrong, we want to say, yes, absolutely, some things are intrinsically wrong. We think any technology that violates the inherent personhood of a person, their dignity, is inherently wrong. And under our consequentialist frame, we think it makes a standard where technology like this is not okay, or is okay, where it is acceptable and morally justifiable to violate people's personhood in the face of economic gain and military gain. I'll pass it to Colette to conclude.
Thank you so much. So overall, we answered a few of your questions today about deterrence, defensive weapons, a little bit pushing back against our framework of consequentialism, and a bit more about intrinsic wrongs, especially when it comes to weaponization. Thank you again so much for your questions. We look forward to your 10-minute presentation and to the judges' questions. We see you the rest of our time.
Okay. So judges, I'm going to give you guys a minute to confer, and then you each get one question and a brief follow-up question. If time permits, I'll open the floor. Your time starts now.
Anyway, as I was saying. think this will pick up my voice.
All right.
Hi. Okay. Well, thank you very much. A nice presentation. So I guess I'm a little concerned about your consequentialist analysis, right? So let me start by saying, whenever you do these sort of policy things, my knee-jerk reaction is consequentialism is always kind of the way to go, right? This is what we want out of government policies. Not 100% of the time, but it's a good strategy. But in this particular case, it seems like your view basically amounts to a couple of empirical claims that, in the long run, a defensive policy will be the best necessarily. And I don't know that there's enough nuance in your position. So I want to give you a chance to sort of amend that. And maybe I'll start over and be briefer. When you do a consequentialist analysis, you should cover all the contingencies, right? You want, it's a rich kind of calculus. And so if your view is like, well, defensive policies, unless we've exhausted all diplomatic things, will maximize consequences. Empirically, I don't know if that's true. So is there a policy that you have that is perhaps more nuanced than that? Under these circumstances, we do this. Under these circumstances, we do that? Or do we just sort of need to be optimistic that will lead to the best consequences? In other words, a million things could happen, right?
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to clarify. I didn't get to touch on this because we were running out of time, but it's also a response to Stanford's 5-minute response to us. And that is about mutually assured destruction. And what happens when you don't take the approach that we're doing, which is to say, sometimes it is okay to have offensive weapons because you care about deterrence. And what we say to that is that maybe it deters or maybe it escalates. More weapons, as Rita has laid out, does not mean that the world as a whole will be safer. It is not a good thing, and it is not, I don't know, like, it doesn't hedge against like really bad things when you have all of these nuclear weapons and just one mistake, one thing can go wrong and all of these really terrible things can happen. We think that weapons can escalate conflicts.
Right. So, brief follow-up. I think I understand that part of your position. But suppose it becomes sort of empirically clear that maybe we develop a technology that allows us to seize an upper hand and yield the best consequences for the greatest number overall, even doing kind of nefarious things, right? Wouldn't the consequentialist analysis or the consequentialist position say, yeah, that's the right thing to do? Do you really want to be a consequentialist when there are so many factors, so many things that could go very differently?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that brings a lot of nuance to what we're saying. An important key distinction here, right, is that what we said is not necessarily what we think about weapons as a whole. This is directly related to space weaponization and space weapons, in which case we see that putting these things that can explode, shoot, do things in space, as we previously mentioned, is a point of no coming back. It is a point at which we put all of our space exploration at risk, right? Our satellites, our GPS, our plane travel, everything which is traveled through, like, kind of used for space. And yet, while it is hard for me to think of an example where what you laid out is true, we are sticking to our consequentialist framework in a way. If that were to be true, I'm going to pass it on to Eva to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, what we really think about the strength of the consequentialist framework for this case and for this policy is that it lets us look expansively at the world and expansively at consequences instead of limiting us just to the US context, right? We think, like, for the example of getting this data or this information through nefarious means, we think that there are consequences there that are bad that maybe outweigh the positive consequences of using this tech. And we think it really nuances our opinion and our view of this policy. We can't account for everything that ever happens, but we do think that, again, consequentialism is a good way to guide us, because I do understand the shortfallings of it, but it lets us look at it all expansively. It lets us consider every factor and the global community as a whole.
All right, thank you so much for this. I just want to, the very first thing you said was defensive weaponry can be developed. And then their criteria were there's a clear threat and all options have been exhausted. Those criteria seem more appropriate to an offensive weapon. Like, you don't use an offensive weapon until there's a clear threat. but you start off by saying defense. So could you clarify for me the criteria for developing defensive weapons versus the criteria for developing offensive weapons? Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. We want to be really clear that the all diplomatic options being exhausted is only for offensive weapons. We think at any time it is morally permissible and encouraged, actually, the right option for the U.S. to do to develop defensive weapons.
Good, thanks.
So part of just kind of approaching this from a very consequentialist perspective could be that we develop offensive weapons because that gives us the consequence harming some to prevent harm for more people. So in that case, wouldn't you argue that, or what would be your position if we were militarizing and advocating for lots of offensive weapons in space because it gives us the advantage to reduce harm for a greater amount of people by having a space weapon?
Yeah, so I would like to just kind of echo what my teammate Vin was talking about before. Sure, there could be a chance that developing this offensive weaponry could deter other bad actors, or there's a chance that it could largely escalate a situation that we do not want escalated. We want to make sure that we're really considering the consequences of our actions in terms of we never, like your judge said, there are a million things that could happen. But having a million things that could happen is more of a reason to kind of have this framework in the first place. It's comprehensive to the global community. Just developing weapons in the name of deterrence might actually work against us.
You have 3 minutes left.
Oh, we got 3 minutes. That's great. I got about 10 questions. No, no. I want to talk. I want to switch us a little bit. I'm struck by the fact that because you use a consequentialist lens, there seems to be pushed to the side national sovereignty, primary obligation of a government to its citizens. I get the point that the United States has been part of a colonial kind of extractive capitalist economy, and so in a way, we have more responsibility than maybe other countries. But it is the case that the United States government's primary responsibility is to the welfare of the nation and its citizens. So that seems like, I love the phrase here was utilitarianism can't bear the weight of that obligation. So I'm wondering how you'd respond to that.
Thank you so much for that question to clarify consequentialism. But one kind of fact that we have been considering here, right? We think of space weapons, or for that fact, well, they require a lot of capital to develop, right? Even right now, when we think of space, not every country is present there. Not every country has its own kind of satellites because that requires a lot of capital and a lot of kind of development on the country's part to have its own space missions, whether that is even scientific research. So when we think of these space weapons, right, we can count on our fingers how many countries are able to put those space weapons into the space. And that has dire consequences, right? Because there aren't 10 countries in the world. There are hundreds of countries that all have their own interests and that all want to look at their citizens. And when we try to kind of maximize the consequences, not only for the United States, but looking at the entire world and the communities that it holds, because we all share one planet, share the same water, share the same air, we think it is of utmost importance to consider the fact that while the US, right, has the capabilities to kind of put so many offensive weapons in space as much as they like, we think of the global situation, right? And we think of all the countries that are not able to do that simply because they might be smaller, right? They have sovereignty that they respect, but there are not that many people that live there, which means they don't have the same amount of access to funds as the United States do. And I'll pass it on if anyone would like to add.
1 minute left. 1 minute.
All right, I'll make it really quick. A lot of the position I take that you had was to couch this idea of diplomacy first and, making sure. But what if that gives away the hand? What if having offense is actually not engaging in conversation, showing people their cards, and then, losing the advantage that one can have?
We think that's incredibly reasonable to ask, but we think it is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you act or you think that no one else will be diplomatic or everyone else will resort to violence, you have to resort to violence, and then everyone else has to resort to violence. If that makes sense? Like, it's really hard in kind of like a global world and a world that is like so divided by nations to think of it this way. We do want to kind of use our radical imagination and think like, how should this work, right? Because we want to maximize the most like the most good in the world, and the most good in the world comes from diplomacy. It doesn't come from further violence, right? Because it's really true that violence does beget violence. The more violence the US does, the more violence other nations do, the more. Thank you.
Go ahead and tally up your scores.
Thank you.
No worries. Judges, let me know when you're ready. Okay, let's switch roles. How many of you are taking bets on what case this is going to be? Uh-huh. I know the pool. I've been in the audience. Ooh. All right, you ready? Case number 15. If you were tasked with producing a policy regarding the term length for federal judges up to and including lifetime appointments, what would that policy look like? And please provide moral justification for your position. You have 2 minutes. Your time starts now.
Yeah.
Yes, at E. To preserve. Wait. Federal judges are special. That's it. Yes. And then why does the current status quo, what is current policy? Is the current policy violate
Text.
Requirements, which is capacity.
You know, we can swap. That just seems to be
sitting for too long today. I know. Jordan can't even text me. Let's go. That was rude. No, it was right. And change directions. That's okay. This is a tradition standard now.
All right, Stanford, that's time. I will give you 3 1-minute nonverbal warnings.
Sorry. Sounds great.
Are we good? All right. Your time starts now.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. Thank you everyone for coming to have this conversation with us today. Thank you for the audience for being here and for clapping and having so much enthusiasm. The question we received is, if you were tasked with producing a policy regarding the term lengths for federal judges up to and including lifetime appointments, what would that policy look like? Please provide moral justifications for your position. Our answer to the question is that we would impose an age limit at the age of 80 for federal judges that currently have lifetime appointments. Our moral justification is going to be derived from Dennis Thompson's theory of public office, Essentially, there are two very important factors that must be upheld for a public official to be acting in a moral capacity, and that is capacity and trust. And we're going to argue that in the status quo without age limits, both of these criteria are being violated. And with our solution, we would have a much more morally justifiable policy about term lengths. With that being said, I'm going to start by passing it off to my teammate Charlotte by deriving the moral foundation of our position.
Thank you so much, Ursula. So, as Ursula said, we're going to be deriving our position from Dennis Thompson's theory of public office ethics. He argues that public officials have special ethical obligations because their unique power is derived from public trust. They are an instrumental part of the institution and therefore must uphold institutional legitimacy, which is central to our democracy. He argues that public officials must have two criteria that they satisfy. The first, public officials must have the capacity to fulfill the duties that they are given. Second, the public must believe in that capacity. This is important because, well, this is the cornerstone of the rule of law, right? In terms of the legitimacy is not only derived from capacity, but also in public trust in that capacity. With that, I'm going to pass it off to my next teammate.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm now going to talk about how federal judges are special and why we need to be particularly concerned about these two criteria when it comes to the case of federal judges. Federal judges have incredible power over the everyday life of Americans. They are able to implement rulings that have a significant impact on our personal liberties in our society, and they also, through their rulings, set precedents that other judges follow later on in the future. Therefore, we see that federal judges, without any type of public democratic elections, are able to exert a tremendous amount of power over our everyday life and the way that our liberties are doled out to us by the government. For this reason, we think it is especially important in this case to be particularly concerned with the capability of those individuals to make those decisions, and also the trust that the public has in those individuals in order to make those decisions that govern our fundamental liberties. With that, I'm going to pass it on to my teammate, Ursula.
Thanks, Georgios. So I'm now going to argue that in the status quo, the absence of age limits means that our two criteria of capacity and trust are both being violated. Let's start with capacity. Old age has been shown to erode memory, which can interfere with the judge's ability to apply past precedent. They need to understand hundreds, thousands of cases in order to apply them to cases at hand, and not being able to remember past cases can erode that ability. It also can erode critical thinking. The ability to engage in moral reasoning is also incredibly important, as judges need to understand the impact of their decisions on the public, especially in a common law system where their decision impacts a lot of future decisions down the line. And so if you have a judge who, because of their old age, has the capacity to make good decisions, we think this first criteria of the theory of public office is being violated. But the second criteria is trust. And we think that there's a specific nuance here that makes it so that trust is of particular importance in the judicial system. The reason why is because when we have lifetime appointments, the public doesn't have an opportunity to renew their trust in an official in the way they can, for example, with a president that they have to re-elect every 4 years. And so the public is saying, we trust this person for the next 4 years to make these decisions. The problem is with lifetime appointments, the public can't renew this trust in the same way. Additionally, trust is specifically important because courts don't have an enforcement mechanism. The Supreme Court and appellate courts make decisions and say, this law is constitutional, this law is unconstitutional, but doesn't have an army of soldiers that is there to enforce these decisions. And that's why public trust in these decisions and trust in the legitimacy of the court is really the only thing we have to make sure these decisions have any moral weight. And in the status quo, we see that the lack of age limits violates this tenet of trust. As the Pew Research Center found, 2/3 of Americans don't want lifetime appointments. And the reason why is because even if you have a perfectly lucid 83-year-old, the public may not believe in the fact that they're perfectly lucid. And so we need to have the trust of the public in the ability of judges to exercise their capacity. With that being said, I'm going to pass it off to my teammate Ali to talk specifically about our solution.
Thanks, Ursula. So now I'm going to bring it back to the question about designing policy based on all the considerations that we've mentioned thus far. So we think that the best solution that incorporates all of our considerations is to establish an age limit at age 80. And we think this is reasonable because our case kind of pulls us in two directions. We don't want judges that are too young because they may lack capacity, they may lack this institutional wisdom and memory that an older judge has, and they may lack trust because age often begets authority. But we also don't want judges that are too old because we know that their capacity declines due to cognitive decline in old age and a loss of fluid intelligence, and they may lack trust, or they may lack public trust because of what we know about what happens to people with old age. So we think this policy of having an age limit of age 80 for federal judges is a Goldilocks solution that is a good middle ground between our two competing intuitions about what a judge's responsibilities really are. And it also allows judges to retire with dignity at around age 80 or at age 80 and step down gracefully when they're old but they're not yet ailing. And with that, I'm now going to pass it off to my next teammate for an objection.
Thank you, Ali. We now want to articulate and respond to some objections that may loom large in the minds of someone with an alternative view. And two of the objections that we want to raise immediately is why not go for a different type of system in order to uphold these two principles of capacity and trust. Namely, why not choose something like term limits where judges are limited to 18 years and therefore each president gets two appointees to the Supreme Court? Or why not implement something like competency tests where we allow judges to serve for as long as they would like, but periodically by a medical professional, they're examined in order to ensure that they haven't entered any type of mental decline that would compromise their ability to effectuate their duties. And so our main response to these points is that it would lead to the politicization of the court, which we consider to be a greater harm than allowing these judges to continue for longer. First, on the point of term limits at 18 years, as I mentioned before, this would mean that each president would get to choose two judges to appoint to the Supreme Court. And we think that this could convert Supreme Court appointments from already a very political thing to something that is a central campaign issue, where presidential candidates campaign on the fact that they're going to appoint these two people to the Supreme Court, knowing that they're going to have two openings, and can therefore use people to stack the court with some ideological extreme. And then on the other end of the alternative solution of competency tests, we think that this also introduces issues around politicization, as happened in New York when the judges were attempted to, when the state did not approve their extensions to be judges beyond the age limit, this triggered a lawsuit. And we think that any time you're trying to decide through some type of test whether a judge is competent or not, this introduces this spectacle of political theater potentially, where there's going to be this back and forth between Republican and Democratic operatives, ones who are trying to support a judge and ones who are trying to actively cast doubt on them. And we think that this could be much more harmful to the trust that the public has in the Supreme Court compared to what is gained by these competency tests. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Mirabai to handle an additional objection.
Thank you, Georgios. Now, another main argument against this idea of a strict age limit is the fact that the political people who are appointing these judges could then just game the system, picking younger judges who are maybe more unqualified in order to maximize their impact. And we recognize that this would actually be problematic because it could contribute to eroding trust in the judicial system, as we've said is very important to uphold. But we also see that this already happens in the current system, where, for instance, presidents already choose people who are younger in order to maximize their impact. So we have to find a way that is the best solution possible. And how we do this is by ensuring that there are safeguards. So things like Senate hearings or Bar Association reviews to make sure that these judges are competent and actually have enough experience to be good judges in the first place. That's how we're making sure that we have this base level of protection as well as this top level.
Thanks, Mirabai. So to summarize, we would impose an age limit at 80 in order to uphold capacity and trust. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing your response.
You have 1 minute to prep. Your time starts now.
I mentioned it in my conclusion. Yeah, and I think we can also appeal to the fact that it's teleological. Like, this is the purpose of I don't know, no, that makes sense. Well, let's say the word teleology is everything we trust.
All right, that's time. All right, McAllister, you have up to 5 minutes to respond to Stanford. Your time starts now.
Thank you guys so much for your wonderful case. We actually agree with you on a lot of the things you talk about in your case, but we just wanted to push your logic a little bit further. Just to summarize, your view on this case is that there should be an age limit for 80 years old for lifetime appointments for federal judges. You talk a lot about the theory of public office and the ethics of that, federal judges being a special role, the absence of age limits, and the current harms we're seeing in the status quo, and a more concrete plan of what you mean by age limits. But we just have a few questions for you. First, Vin and I are going to talk a little bit about the role of public trust and how that plays in your case. Ruta is going to talk a little bit about polarization, and then Eva finally has some questions about standards we see in other countries and ageism. So first up, I'm going to pass it over to my teammate Vin to talk about public trust.
Thank you, Colette. You guys talk about the importance of public trust, that politicians can renew trust with the people through elections. And I presume that the reason why you're saying that that Supreme Court justices and federal judges shouldn't be elected is because of politicization. But justices and judges are already political. So why not just embrace that? Why not just say that everybody has biases, everybody has political opinions, and have elections to renew the trust that seems to be missing from judges, at least from your presentation?
Thank you so much for that question, Vin. Another thing that we're really thinking about is, right, you mentioned that with term limits, what we would do is stack the court with ideological extreme. My question would be, is that not what is happening now, where kind of your system still does not take away the opportunity for judges to retire, or does it, right? They could still retire when their party is in office, when their Senate is in the majority. And currently, with whether the age limit is until the judge passes away or the age limit is 80 years old, the stacking with political extremes, it still happens, and your solution does not remedy it. So we were wondering your justification for that.
Yeah, I just want to kind of ask a combination of both of those questions. You talk a lot about public trust and the politicization of the court, but I want to know how that's held up in the status quo and how you choose to fix that. I mean, Republicans have lost 5 of the 8 last elections, but they have 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices that we're seeing right now. Isn't that the polarization that you guys are trying to avoid in the first place? How is that building public trust? The public elected these officials, but the Supreme Court doesn't reflect this, especially when judges strategically retire when the party they like is in place in order to quickly streamline another judge there. And so finally, I'm going to pass it on to my teammate, Eva.
Thank you so much, Colette. Another thing that we really found really fascinating was your age limit of 80. We kind of get the thrust behind it, but we want to kind of dive into why 80 specifically. Why not take note from other countries such as the UK, where the age is 75, or other professions where they are holding the lives of people in their hands, right? You note how important the Supreme Court is and or all federal courts are, and how they affect the everyday lives of people. But pilots have to retire at the age of 65. Air traffic controllers have to retire at 55. Why are you keeping this age so high? If other professions are setting this bar, why not the federal courts, especially if you are noting how central they are in people's lives, how important they are? I'll pass it on to Ruta to talk a little bit more.
Next, we'd like to ask a question, right, about the rhetoric you have about age and capacity. We reject the premise that young judges lack capacity. We think that recognizing capacity, that is not at all attached to age. We believe that a young judge in a situation can have way more capacity than an old one, and capacity should be judged always on merit and not embrace these ageist ideas that kind of justifies, right, discrimination of people based on age. We were wondering, how do you, under your framework, justify this assumption?
Yes, thank you so much, Ruta. So just to conclude, you guys talk a lot in your case about how you want the age limit for 80 to be put in place for lifetime appointments for federal judges. But we had a few questions for you guys today. First, about trust. Secondly, about polarization and the combination of those two things. Third, we asked you about why 80 as the age limit when other countries have done differently. And finally, we had a quick question about age and capacity. Again, thank you so much for your 10-minute presentation, and we really look forward to hearing your response to our questions. We see the rest of our time.
All right, Stanford, you have 1 minute. Your time starts now.
Do you want to why we shouldn't embrace polarization in judges? Yeah, I can do that. But that's the same thing. Everything on the top is just about. No, but like, why should we just politicize judges already? I'm gonna. Okay, I'll let you take care of it. Why don't we elect judges? Who's giving these constitutional?
All right, that's time. Stanford, you have 5 minutes to respond to the commentary, and your time starts now.
Okay, thank you so much, Mallister, for this enlightening commentary. We look forward to responding to some of your objections. I would say your first three objections fall from a similar line of reasoning, which is that realistically, the court is already very, very polarized. We're not going to come up here and disagree with you. We agree that the status quo is not perfect. I'm going to argue in response to the objections that our solution would make things better and that these other solutions would make things worse. So let's start with your argument about why don't we just start electing judges? Because that would fix the problem of the trust in the judicial system while not making the problem of polarization any worse because it's already very polarized. We think that elections would make the problem of polarization way worse. And the reason why is because judges ought not be basing their decisions on the possibility of re-election. Even though the court is very polarized right now, we think it would be way worse if Clarence Thomas and Amy Coney Barrett were making their decisions hoping that Republicans are going to elect them again. And on top of this more pragmatic idea of whether or not it's going to increase or decrease polarization, I want to turn to the reason why the judicial branch was created in the first place. And that's because the judicial branch was not created to execute the public's wishes. That was the purpose of the executive branch and the legislative branch. The judicial branch was supposed to be this independent branch that serves as the check on other branches. That's the reason why we don't elect them, because they're not meant to directly uphold our wishes, but to do so indirectly by checking the other two branches. And so we want to make sure that these judges are not basing their decisions on hoping to get elected by a partisan party. With that being said, you also talk about how judges are still going to be able to retire when their party's still in office. We don't think we make that problem any different. That's just a problem that's going to exist. But we do think that having the other solutions like Giorgio's talked about of testing judges to make sure they're still competent would lead to a rise in polarization. With that being said, I'm going to pass it off to one of my teammates to talk about the solution of ages 80.
Thank you, Ursula. So, you guys asked us near the end of your commentary 2 questions, and they were both pertaining to the idea of like younger judges, right? So your first question is, why don't we have a lower age limit? You guys proposed that it was a 75-year-old age limit in the UK, and that also it's 65-year-old retirement age for pilots. And to that we would say, the reason why we've instituted an 80-year-old age limit is because we believe that it is important that judges are able to build institutional memory. That was the very reason why lifetime tenure was first established. We believe that there is a value to wisdom and to judges being able to accumulate that wisdom over time. And we've seen that in the case of India, where the age limit for federal judges is 65. There's been precedent that's been set that 65 is an insufficient age limit. Another example that is closer to home is that Judge Bates' recent ruling to deny President Trump's executive order on removing birthright citizenship was only, well, many legal experts believe, upheld because of all the institutional memory he had built as an old judge that was elected in the Reagan era. So, the second objection that you guys have was, well, young judges can have capacity too. And to that, again, we say, we believe, yes, they would have high fluid intelligence, but they would not have this ability to build institutional memory. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Georgios.
Thank you, Charlotte. One final point that you raised at the end of your commentary was this issue of ageism and whether either by being slightly biased against younger judges who don't have this institutional memory or forcing judges who are 80 years or above to retire, we're being ageist, meaning we're discriminating against people unfairly based on their age. And we would say that ageism is fundamentally different than something else like racism or sexism. The reason we make this difference is because, say being white, I accumulate the advantages of being white over my entire lifetime, where someone who is black accumulates the disadvantages of being black over their entire lifetime. Whereas with ageism, it's different. If we privilege the young or privilege the old, even though I might be young and have some privilege or harm at the moment and someone older might gain a privilege or benefit, I too will accumulate that privilege or harm at the older age, just as the older person had that privilege or harm at the younger age. So because age is something that we all pass through and all pass through different stages in our life, it is not the same thing as comparing it to racism or sexism, which is often why we respond to ageism in such a critical way, because we're accumulating different over lifetime. Thank you very much.
All right, judges, you have 1 minute.
Good job, Ursula.
Okay. All right, judges, you have 10 minutes. Remember, you have one question, follow-up question. Time remains, so I'll open the floor up. So your time starts now.
Thank you so much. So I want to start off and ask how we've determined that cognitive decline and capacity is completely reduced at that specific 80-year-old mark. Why or how?
Can we take a moment to confer?
Sure.
Why isn't it 18?
Yeah,
it's just a
vagueness. Okay, thanks so much for the question. So my understanding of the question is that 80 is a very specific age, and people age cognitively at different rates. And so why are we just choosing this kind of vague and arbitrary number 80? And I think the reason why is because with any sort of age limit, there's going to be inherent vagueness, but we have to be basing it off of averages. We can take an example of being able to vote when you're 18. Not all people maybe are equally mature when they're 18, but we need to draw the cutoff somewhere. And so we use the average capacity of people to make decisions at that age. We'd say the same thing at 80. We are thinking of averaging the benefit of institutional memory with also the effects of cognitive decline. And yes, we're going to choose a cutoff that's going to lead to some perfectly lucid judges stepping down and other people who may have already been past a level of decline we're okay with still being in power or in office. But that's just because we have to operate with averages and acknowledge that vagueness is just inherent to any age limit we can ever impose.
So my follow-up is, we are kind of taking a gamble because you feel like capacity and trust, which is the central component for what we should look forward to in judges, you're saying that at 80, that's a little risky. But what if it's, averages come out and we see that 70 is maybe that age, or maybe 60. So that central tenet of capacity and trust, why is it 80? Why isn't it 70? Why isn't it 60?
Yeah, one moment to confer.
So we wanted to start off by saying this question asked us to give a very specific policy, and we wanted to make sure that we could give the best answer that we can. But we also want to realize that if we were truly going to enact this, we wouldn't just arbitrarily choose a number. We would do research, and we would actually advocate for a panel of experts, because who are we to decide when someone is competent versus not? And I think actually by creating this panel of experts who would look at all of the research, who would look at what judges are actually doing and their capacities at different ages, and then by making a choice, that would actually help uphold these ideas of public trust, because we could show the rigorous process that we've gone through to actually choose this cutoff. However, because we had to come with an answer here and have a very specific choice, we've used our best knowledge to come up with the number of 80.
Oh, just to very clearly answer your question, we don't have all of the facts. If the facts did come out, like you said, and it turned out that 70 was the appropriate average or 60, we would change our position. Like, we think that at the end of the day, public trust and capacity are the two most important things.
Okay, as somebody who my young son and students would certainly describe as well into his golden years, I want to thank you for your very elaborate defense of ageism, and specifically ageism. Ageism is, you're welcome. That's the other old guy in the room. Ageism is different from racism and sexism because you come into your age and your gender and your race, etc., your whole life. So I'm not sure why that's morally relevant that you don't have it the whole time. But by that reasoning, my friend Eric, who some years ago converted to Judaism, should be subject to anti-Semitic rants, because people could say, "Nah, you weren't Jewish until you were 42." So tough luck. I mean, explain that.
Yeah, can we take a moment to confer?
Yeah, good idea. That might have been like a line. I'm sorry. I'm getting old.
Oh, well, thank you for that question. I can begin to answer, and one of my teammates will pick up. I think Georgios maybe was a little overzealous in justifying ageism. I think that I think the moral backing there was more to kind of justify this claim we've made that it's okay to have a legally codified age limit somewhere. We would never really have a legally codified limit against women from entering a certain place or Black people from using a certain public facility, or having a certain job, right? So I think that was kind of meant to be this justification as to why ageism is different, such that we think we could actually codify an age limit into the law. But obviously, we generally would, condemn ageism in other circumstances, especially if, someone is just being denied a privilege because of their age, when we're not talking about something specific like the public right of the public office, right? Where we think that these two other principles are really important. Does anyone want to add? Yeah.
So, I'd just like to also add that in our case, we believe that this kind of like individual claim to office that you wish to exercise, right, as maybe an 85-year-old, is outweighed by this power that you're able to exert over the public. A very good example that the other team gave was that of a pilot, right? I don't think that it is ageist for there to be a 65-year cutoff for pilots, as unfortunate as it is, because we think that the safety of passengers must be prioritized over their individual claim to their job posting.
Great. Yeah, brief follow-up. Would you be willing to get off my lawn? Go ahead, Mark.
All right.
Thank you very much.
That was okay. All right. So I want to. always had a dream about being a Supreme Court judge, but you're making it terrifying because I have to have the whole institutional memory and knowledge of the law before I could ever be a judge. But in fact, judges have clerks and they have whole systems of communal knowledge creation. And so it's not really on the judge. The judge doesn't have that all in his or her head. It's distributed in this community that they create to help them do their job. So I'm wondering that, because that didn't come up at all, I'm just wondering if that changes your concerns about the trust and the competency, if in fact there's a whole community of people that are helping the judge do her job.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I can get us started just for the sake of time. We recognize what you're saying, that judges are not unitary actors. They have clerks, they have books that write down all these laws. They don't need to have it all memorized. That would be ridiculous. And so I guess what I would argue is that this is definitely the case, and it can maybe mute some of our concerns, but there are also some unique things that the judge does need to do by themselves. Like, they are listening to oral arguments being made in front of them in the court, and they're the ones asking the attorneys questions. That's something that they can't whisper to their clerks for help in the moment. And they're also the ones with the final decision-making power. So what I would start by answering is that we do think, despite the lots of help that judges can receive, there are some times that they need to make unitary decisions in which we would say capacity is necessary. Do any of my teammates want to add, or do you want to ask a follow-up?
Well, yeah, because I want to connect it to something you said earlier about the fact that you could have a panel of experts. If, since you're not experts at this, so if we were actually going to do this, we get a panel of experts to come together and decide what age would be appropriate, seems to fly in the face of your earlier criticism of some kind of competency test, because that would become politicized. So it seems like it's a very potentially explosive situation where you're going to try to determine either what age or what particular individual. I think it's the same problem. So I'm just wondering how that fits together with.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it makes sense to us because we could have a process for both. And I think the distinction that we would make is when setting an age limit by some panel, they would have to set the age limit uniformly for all judges. Whereas when we get into the realm of competency tests, it's you, Clarence Thomas, you, Amy Coney Barrett, you, other judge. And those decisions are very much focused on the individual judge at hand, and they're not something that's being applied uniformly to the court. And so we think because that it's being applied to a specific judge rather than uniformly, that introduces the opportunity for opponents of that judge to really dig in and attack that judge through these competency tests. Whereas on the other hand, if we're trying to define an age limit for all judges, we don't have the same opportunity, because on the court there are both liberal and conservative judges. And so they would have to apply whatever terrible thing they would like to apply to the other side to their own side as well. And so with that kind of equalization, we think it would be less politicized. But of course, anything will be politicized when it comes to the Supreme Court because of its inherent power.
All right, we're going to let the judges tally up their scores. So let's give another round of applause for our two finalists. I'm going to double check some math.
Check that math.
You guys are incredible.
You're giving that back to me.
Yeah.
Check it out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly.
This is what happens when it's unscripted.
That was very funny, by the way. Thank you.
I'm really
Yeah, give me a second.
All right, so you go first. You're gonna go second. Yeah, it tells me when she's done. Use your formal name.
Sorry. Go ahead. I mean, 3 years of just all kind of coming back to this stage. But I mean, this is really fun. We have all your timers. They're so cute. Thank you. Amazon. Courtesy of Amazon. They have like little stars. Can you guys see it? I trust you.
I think they came to mind because of the news that we can see.
Yeah.
Clarence Thomas and then her. Yeah, she's the youngest.
So you're gonna go last.
All right.
Yours on there.
Yeah, I have the sheet right here. Yeah.
All right, you guys ready? This is going to go with 2018, but if you notice, we have filled up. We're going to have to put a new tier on. Stanley Cup. For the winner next year. This one is going to go to today's winner, forever. All right. Judges, are you ready? Richard, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I scored it 44 for team 1, 43 for team 2. So Mallister on my card.
Mark.
Okay, first of all, I have to shout out to the birds, Eagles. All right, so all right. Okay, sorry, I forgot to do that in my intro. All right, so I have 46 for team 1, 48 for team 2.
Last judge.
It's on you. It's on you.
This is too much pressure. Before I have to announce mine. Great job. Overall, there's, like I said, winners on all fronts. 48 for team 1, 47 for team 2. Good job. Good job. Congrats.
Thank you all for an amazing bowl. We'll see you next year.
I think you guys should hold up to take pictures. Stanford, hold up.
Excellent. Super, super impressed with you guys.
Thank you so much. Great job. You guys were so